The heat in the chamber was already rising when I reached the viewing rail, and I knew I was too late to stop anything. Ambassador Renata Osei stood inside a ring of pale light, her wrists bound by thin bands of energy, while 7 members of the Galactic Council watched from their high seats, without a single flicker of doubt on their strange faces. I gripped the rail so hard my knuckles turned white, and I screamed her name, but the sound bounced off walls built from a material that seemed to swallow every human voice whole. The Council called it a ritual of correction. They said Earth had broken a treaty clause buried so deep in the founding documents that even our own legal teams had never found it. I did not believe that explanation then, and I do not believe it now. I believe they wanted to send a message to the newest species in the galaxy, a message written in fire, so that no one would forget their place. I was only the junior aide. My job was schedules, translations, small talk with delegates who barely noticed I existed. I was never supposed to matter in this story, but I was standing there when the light around Renata began to change color, shifting from pale white to a deep, burning gold, and I understood that I was about to watch someone I respected die in front of an audience of 1,000 different species, broadcast to every corner of the galaxy at once. Renata did not scream. I want that remembered above everything else. She lifted her chin, looked past the council seats, past the cameras, past every creature gathered to watch her end, and she found me in the crowd. Her eyes were calm, in a way that terrified me more than any scream could have. She said one sentence, clear and steady, and it carried through the chamber, because the council wanted her final words recorded for their archives, proof of their authority, for every species watching. She said, "Do not grieve for me, remember me instead, and let them learn what that means." Then the gold light closed around her, and I turned my face away, because some things are not meant to be watched, only carried afterward. When I looked back, the ritual was finished, and the council members were already rising from their seats, discussing trade schedules as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I do not remember walking out of that chamber. I remember standing on the docking platform with 2 security officers pulling me toward our shuttle, my legs moving without my permission, my mind still trapped inside that room. Delegates from a dozen worlds watched me pass, some with something like pity in their expressions, most with simple curiosity, the way you might watch an animal react to a loud noise. One delegate, a tall being with silver skin and no visible mouth, stepped into my path as I reached the shuttle ramp. It spoke through a translator device clipped to its chest, its voice flat and without any warmth. It said that my species should consider this a valuable lesson in humility, and that compliance was always easier than defiance. I did not answer. I did not have words left in me. I walked past it and into the shuttle, and the doors sealed behind me with a sound like a held breath finally released. Through the small window, I watched the council spires shrink into the darkness, tall structures of white stone that had once impressed me with their beauty. Now they only looked cold, monuments built by beings who believed they could burn a diplomat alive and return to their schedules without consequence. The pilot, a quiet man named Callum Ashford, did not ask me anything during the flight. He simply flew, his jaw tight, his knuckles pale on the controls, and I understood that he had watched the broadcast too, along with every other human stationed anywhere near council space. Somewhere behind us, on 100 worlds, humans working as translators, traders, scientists, and soldiers had all seen the same footage at the same moment. I did not know it then, but the reaction had already begun, quiet and invisible, spreading through our species like a current beneath still water. I thought about Renata's final words the entire journey home. "Do not grieve, remember." I did not understand yet what those words would come to mean for the rest of the galaxy. I only knew that something had shifted inside me, something that used to believe in patience and diplomacy, and slow, careful progress. By the time our shuttle docked at the orbital station above Earth, my hands had stopped shaking, but something colder had settled into their place. I stepped out into the corridor and found it unusually quiet, filled with people standing in small groups, watching screens, speaking in low voices. No one was crying, no one was shouting, The silence felt heavier than any noise could have been. An officer I did not recognize approached me, his expression unreadable, and asked if I was the aide from the council delegation. I said yes. He nodded once, said that Fleet Command wanted a full report, and escorted me through corridors that seemed to grow quieter with every step. I looked at the faces around me as we walked, engineers, clerks, soldiers, all watching the same recording on repeat, all wearing the same expression. It was not sorrow. It was something closer to resolve, cold and complete, the kind of expression I imagine our ancestors wore before every great turning point in our history. I did not know then that I was witnessing the last quiet moment before everything changed. I only knew that the galaxy had just made a terrible mistake, and that my species, whatever our faults, had never been good at forgetting. When I finally reached the briefing room, I saw a wall screen still playing the final seconds of the broadcast, frozen on Renata's calm, steady face. Someone had paused it there instead of turning it off, as if no one could bring themselves to let that image disappear just yet. I sat down across from the officer, folded my trembling hands together, and began to recount everything I had seen, every word, every detail. I did not know that my report would become one of the first pieces of evidence used to justify what came next. I only knew that Renata's final words were already spreading faster than any council broadcast ever could, whispered from station to station, ship to ship, home to home. Do not grieve. Remember. I remembered, as the shuttle carried me away from the council spires, the first time Renata had spoken to me privately, months before that final broadcast. She had found me nervous and unsure of myself during my earliest days on the delegation, still learning which gestures meant respect among a dozen different species and which meant grave insult. She had told me then that diplomacy was not about pleasing everyone in the room, but about representing something true, even when the room did not want to hear it. I had not understood her fully at the time. I understood her completely now. I thought about the small kindnesses she had shown throughout our time together, remembering how she insisted on learning the names of every junior staff member on the delegation, how she requested translations be checked twice whenever a phrase might carry unintended weight, how she once delayed an important meeting simply because a colleague from Earth had fallen ill, and she refused to proceed without someone at her side who understood the medical terminology involved. She treated every person, human or otherwise, as though their dignity mattered as much as her own authority. It was that same conviction, I now understood, that had made her impossible for the council to simply intimidate into silence. Callum broke the quiet only once during the remainder of our flight, asking whether I thought Earth would respond formally, perhaps through some diplomatic protest lodged with neutral observers, perhaps through economic pressure applied slowly over years. I told him I did not know, though something in his question told me he already suspected the answer would be far less measured than anything our species had attempted before. When we docked at the orbital station, I noticed something else that I had missed in my earlier shock. Groups of engineers and technicians gathered near public displays, not weeping, not shouting, simply watching in a silence that felt coordinated rather than accidental, as though some unspoken agreement had already passed between every person present. A woman standing near the door turned to look at me as I passed, recognizing perhaps the delegation insignia still pinned to my jacket, and she said nothing at all, only nodded once, a small gesture that somehow carried more weight than any words could have offered. I would carry those words for the rest of my life, but I was not the one who would answer them. That task belonged to people like Captain Elias Voss, standing at that very moment on the deck of a modest defense ship, watching the same broadcast with a stillness that would soon become the quietest declaration of war the galaxy had ever seen. The alert light on my console blinked red at 0400 hours, and I was already awake, because I had not slept since the broadcast 3 days earlier. I am Captain Elias Voss, and I commanded a modest defense cruiser stationed at the edge of human space, far from the grand halls of the Galactic Council, yet close enough to feel the shockwave of what had happened there. I opened the encrypted channel expecting new orders, perhaps a formal complaint filed through diplomatic channels, perhaps a request for patience while our leaders negotiated some kind of apology. What I received instead was a single line of text from Fleet Command, 4 words long, and it changed the shape of my future entirely. All ambassadors, recall immediately. I stared at that message for a long moment, understanding that something larger than any apology was beginning. Within hours, every human diplomat stationed anywhere near Council territory received the same order. Trade envoys packed their offices. Cultural attachés closed their doors. Scientific exchange programs, some decades old, ended without explanation given to our alien hosts. I remember speaking with my communications officer, a sharp young woman named Freya Lindquist, who monitored outgoing signals from Earth and its colonies. She told me something strange was happening across every channel we used to maintain with Council worlds. Nothing was being sent at all. Not a single diplomatic word, not a single trade request, not even routine acknowledgments that ships had passed through Council checkpoints safely. Humanity had gone silent, and I do not mean silent in the sense of having nothing to say. I mean silent in the way a held breath goes silent before a great effort, the kind of silence that exists only in the moment before something irreversible begins. The Council, from what our few remaining listening posts could tell, did not understand what was happening. Their diplomats sent message after message, first curious, then concerned, then increasingly urgent, asking why Earth had withdrawn from every joint program, every trade agreement, every scientific partnership we shared. They received no reply, not one word, not one gesture, nothing but the vast quiet of a species that had decided talking was finished for now. I was ordered back to a shipyard orbiting Mars, and what I saw there stunned me more than the broadcast itself had. The yards that had once produced modest trade vessels and small patrol craft were now running 3 full shifts around the clock. Workers moved through corridors with a grim focus I had never witnessed before, welding hulls, installing weapon systems, assembling ships whose designs I did not recognize from any current fleet manual. I found my old friend Damon Whitfield overseeing one of the construction bays, sleeves rolled up, a tablet full of specifications glowing in his hand. I asked him what exactly we were building, and he looked at me with tired eyes before answering that these were not new designs at all. They were old ones, pulled from archives most people believed had been sealed forever, blueprints drawn from the darkest chapters of human history, when our species fought wars against itself with a ferocity that still shames some historians. He told me something I have never forgotten. He said that humanity had spent centuries learning how to end conflicts quickly and completely, not through slow attrition, but through decisive, overwhelming force applied all at once. Those lessons had been locked away after the wars that nearly destroyed our own planet, deemed too dangerous, too costly, too painful to revisit. Now it seemed, someone in command had decided those lessons were needed again. I walked through those shipyards for hours, watching engineers pull knowledge from a past most of us preferred to forget, reshaping it into something meant for the stars rather than for our own world. It should have frightened me. Instead, I felt something colder settle into my chest, a certainty that we were no longer simply reacting to an insult. We were preparing for something total. Recruitment offices across Earth and its colonies filled within days, though almost no one announced why. Veterans who had left service years earlier returned without being asked twice. Engineers who worked in unrelated industries requested transfers to defense projects. Scientists who studied alien technology out of curiosity now studied it with a very different purpose in mind. I met one of these recruits personally, a woman named Isolde Marchetti, who had lost her brother during what the Council called a routine border enforcement action 3 years earlier, an action that had killed several human colonists without any formal apology or explanation ever given. She told me she had waited 3 years for someone in power to finally act, and she did not care what form that action took, only that it finally arrived. Not everyone who joined this effort wore a uniform. I visited a coastal town on Earth during a brief leave granted before our final deployment, and I found ordinary citizens organizing supply drives for families of recalled personnel, teachers adjusting lesson plans to explain what had happened without frightening younger students, retired engineers volunteering their expertise at nearby fabrication plants without being asked for anything in return. No single authority had ordered any of this. It simply happened, spreading through communities the way a shared understanding sometimes spreads faster than any official announcement ever could. I spoke with a shipbuilder named Dorian Castellane at one of these fabrication plants, a man old enough to remember stories his grandparents told about Earth's last great conflicts, stories most people preferred to leave in the past. He told me he had never expected to see those old techniques revived in his lifetime, yet he did not hesitate when asked to return to work. He said that some lines once crossed by someone else leave a person no honest choice but to respond, regardless of how difficult that response might prove to be. I began to realize that the execution of Ambassador Osei had not created humanity's anger from nothing. It had simply broken open a container that had been filling for years. Small grievances, small injustices, small moments where our species had swallowed insult after insult in the name of maintaining peace with civilizations far more numerous and far more established than our own. Now that container had shattered completely, and there was no reasonable argument left to hold the pieces together. I received new orders 3 weeks after the broadcast, assigning me to a task force forming under a designation I had never heard before, one that did not exist in any standard fleet registry. My commanding officer, an admiral named Corvin Ashby, briefed a small group of us personally rather than through any recorded channel, which told me immediately how seriously command was treating operational secrecy. Admiral Ashby stood before a star map showing Council territory in far more detail than I believed we possessed: supply routes, shipyard locations, communication relay stations, defensive postings around dozens of worlds. He explained that Earth had spent every day since the broadcast gathering information through channels the Council never suspected we maintained: human traders, human workers embedded in alien industries, even some alien sympathizers disturbed by what they had witnessed. He told us plainly that Earth did not intend to send an ultimatum. There would be no formal declaration, no diplomatic warning, no opportunity for the Council to prepare a defense or negotiate terms. Humanity intended to strike first, strike everywhere possible at once, and strike with enough force that resistance would become meaningless before it could properly begin. He also explained something I had not fully appreciated until that moment: that Earth's strategy depended heavily on speed rather than raw numbers. Our fleet remained smaller than the combined forces the Council could theoretically summon from every client species under its authority. Our advantage rested entirely on striking so many critical points simultaneously that no coordinated response could form before the damage became irreversible. He compared it to a controlled collapse rather than a prolonged siege, removing the supports of an entire structure at once rather than chipping away at its edges over months or years. I asked him, perhaps foolishly, whether this approach concerned him, given how it differed from every previous method of conflict resolution used among the galaxy's established species. He looked at me for a long moment before answering that every other species in the galaxy fought wars designed to be survived, wars with rules, rituals, negotiated surrenders, and slow returns to normal relations afterward. He said humanity had learned, through bitter experience on our own world, that wars designed to be survived tend to be repeated again and again because neither side ever truly loses enough to abandon the idea of fighting once more. Total, decisive action, applied swiftly and without hesitation, was the only method our species had ever found that actually ended conflicts for good. I did not fully understand what that meant until the day our fleet gathered at a hidden staging point beyond the edge of charted space, a location so remote that even our own long-range sensors struggled to maintain contact with Earth. Hundreds of ships assembled there, vessels built in secret over the previous weeks, crewed by people pulled from every corner of human society, united by a grief and anger that no diplomat could have negotiated away. I stood on the observation deck of my own ship the night before our first jump, watching the assembled fleet stretch farther than I could see, running lights dimmed to avoid detection, engines humming in perfect, silent readiness. Freya joined me there, her expression calm despite everything building around us, and she told me something I have carried with me ever since. She said that for the first time since the broadcast, she finally understood what Renata Osei's final words truly meant. Do not grieve, remember. She said humanity was not preparing for revenge born from sorrow. We were preparing an answer born from memory, a refusal to let cruelty define our relationship with the rest of the galaxy, without consequence. I looked out at that fleet, thousands of lives, thousands of stories, thousands of grievances gathered into a single, silent purpose, and I felt the weight of what we were about to become. Whatever the galaxy believed about humanity before, whatever assumptions the Council had made when they decided our species could be corrected through fear, those assumptions were about to be tested against a truth they had never considered. At exactly 0600 hours the following morning, the first jump beacon activated across our entire fleet simultaneously, a signal visible only to our own systems, invisible to any Council sensor array. I felt my ship shudder as the drive engaged, space folding around us in that brief, disorienting moment every spacefarer learns to endure. When the shudder passed and my sensors stabilized, I found myself staring at a display showing our fleet spread across a dozen different jump points, each one aimed toward a different target within Council territory. Shipyards, communication relays, supply depots, all positioned for a coordinated strike that would begin within hours. The Council still had no idea what was coming. Their listening posts detected nothing unusual, because we had spent every day since the broadcast ensuring that our approach remained completely silent. They believed humanity was simply withdrawing in grief, perhaps preparing some future diplomatic protest, perhaps simply mourning quietly before eventually returning to the negotiating table as we always had before. They did not understand that the negotiating table no longer existed for us. They did not understand that somewhere in every human heart aboard that fleet, Renata Osei's final words had become something closer to a covenant than a memory, a promise that her death would mean something the galaxy could never forget. I closed my eyes for one final moment of quiet before beginning final preparations, and I thought of Mira Kessler, the young aide who had witnessed everything from that terrible viewing rail, whose testimony had helped confirm every detail command needed to plan what came next. I did not know her personally, but I understood that her account, along with Renata's final words, had become the spark that finally united an entire species around a single, unbending purpose. The war humanity was about to begin would not resemble anything the galaxy had witnessed before, and by the time the Council understood the scale of what they had provoked, it would already be far too late to change course. The first strike began at a shipyard the Council called Waypoint 6, a massive orbital construction facility responsible for building nearly a third of their patrol fleet. I watched the assault unfold from the command deck of my cruiser, positioned at the edge of the formation, ready to move in should reinforcements be needed, though I suspected within minutes that reinforcements would not be necessary at all. Our smaller strike ships dropped out of their jump points in near-perfect silence, formations spreading across the shipyard's perimeter before the facility's defense systems had even finished registering their arrival. I heard Freya's voice over the comm channel, calm and precise, reporting that Council defense grids were only now beginning to activate, far too late to organize any meaningful resistance. Council military doctrine, as we later learned from captured records, assumed that any conflict would begin with formal notice, diplomatic posturing, perhaps a period of escalating threats before actual engagement began. Their shipyards were built for efficiency and production, not for sudden, silent assault. Their defense crews had been trained for ceremonial patrol duties and slow, ritualized confrontations between rival fleets who respected certain unspoken rules. We did not follow those rules because we had never agreed to them in the first place. Within 20 minutes, Waypoint 6's primary production rings had been disabled, its defense turrets destroyed before most of its crew even reached their stations, and its command staff had surrendered through an open channel, confusion evident in every word they spoke. They kept asking why no warning had been given, why no formal declaration had preceded such an assault, as if the absence of ceremony was itself the greatest violation they had suffered. I did not answer their questions directly. Instead, I ordered a single message transmitted to their surviving command staff, a recording of Ambassador Osei's final words, unedited, exactly as she had spoken them in that burning chamber. Do not grieve, remember. I wanted them to understand precisely why ceremony no longer applied to this conflict. Reports from other strike groups arrived throughout the following hours, each one following a similar pattern. Communication relay stations across 3 sectors went dark almost simultaneously, cutting off large portions of Council territory from Central Command entirely. Supply depots supporting their Western fleet were seized or destroyed before their garrisons could organize any coordinated defense. Smaller patrol squadrons, caught completely unprepared, either surrendered quickly or were disabled within minutes of engagement. I began to understand, as those reports accumulated, just how thoroughly humanity had studied Council military structure during the years we spent as their newest, most closely observed member species. Every weakness we had quietly catalogued during routine diplomatic visits, every vulnerability we had noted during joint training exercises meant to build trust between our peoples, all of it became a target list, executed with brutal efficiency. Admiral Ashby summoned senior commanders to a briefing 3 days into the campaign, and I could see something shifting in his expression as he reviewed our progress. He explained that Council forces were beginning to organize a counter-offensive, gathering ships from several allied client species at a fortified position known as the Threshold Gate, a heavily defended junction connecting 3 major trade routes and considered one of the most strategically vital locations in their entire territory. He told us that Council Command believed a decisive stand at the Threshold Gate would finally halt our advance, drawing on ships and traditions from species who had fought together for centuries under Council authority. He also told us that our intelligence networks had already mapped their entire defensive formation in detail, thanks to information gathered from client species growing increasingly resentful of Council rule during the very crisis we had created. I led the vanguard element assigned to the Threshold Gate engagement, commanding a formation of cruisers built specifically for close, decisive combat rather than the slow, attrition-based warfare favored by most Council client species. As we approached the jump point, I gathered my senior officers for a final briefing, and I told them plainly what I expected from the coming battle. I told them that the ships waiting for us at the Threshold Gate had been built and trained for wars meant to be survived, wars where both sides expected to return home afterward to negotiate new terms. I told them that we were not fighting that kind of war, and that our victory depended entirely on demonstrating, immediately and completely, that resistance carried a cost far greater than any previous conflict in this galaxy had ever demanded. When our fleet emerged at the Threshold Gate, I saw the Council formation spread before us, hundreds of vessels arranged in wide, ceremonial patterns designed to project overwhelming strength through sheer numbers and visual intimidation. Their ships carried elaborate markings denoting rank and lineage, decorative elements that spoke to centuries of tradition and honor among species who had fought each other under carefully negotiated rules for generations. Our formation, by comparison, appeared almost plain, functional vessels without decoration, arranged not for intimidation, but for efficient, coordinated movement. I imagine, looking back, that our simplicity must have seemed almost insulting to commanders who valued tradition so deeply, an unspoken suggestion that we did not consider their customs worth honoring even through simple visual respect. The battle began the moment their formation opened fire, a coordinated volley meant to demonstrate their combined strength before any actual maneuvering occurred, a display more suited to ceremony than genuine tactical advantage. Our ships scattered immediately into pre-planned attack patterns, refusing to remain still long enough for such displays to matter, striking at their formation's weakest points before their commanders could adjust to our unfamiliar approach. I watched through my tactical display as our smaller, faster vessels moved through gaps in their formation that a more traditional fleet would never have dared attempt, striking directly at command ships and coordination vessels rather than engaging their strongest defensive elements first. Their fleet, built around centuries of ritualized combat expectations, struggled to reorganize quickly enough to counter tactics that ignored every convention they had trained for. Within the first hour, 3 of their largest command vessels had been disabled, cutting communication between different sections of their formation and forcing individual squadrons to make decisions without central coordination for the first time many of their commanders had ever experienced in actual combat. I heard confusion spreading across their communication channels, commanders asking for instructions that no longer arrived, squadrons uncertain whether to advance, retreat, or hold position. I remember one exchange in particular during the height of the engagement, when a squadron of their fastest interceptors attempted to flank our formation from the far side of the gate, hoping to catch our support vessels unprotected. Our sensors detected the maneuver almost immediately, and I redirected a reserve group under Lieutenant Commander Petra Solheim to intercept before the interceptors ever reached firing range. She reported afterward that their pilots seemed genuinely startled when our ships anticipated a maneuver they believed too unconventional for any opponent to predict, a maneuver drawn directly from tactics their own academy still taught as a guaranteed method of breaking enemy lines. That single moment told me everything I needed to understand about why this battle was unfolding so differently from what Council commanders expected. They had trained for generations against opponents who fought according to shared assumptions, shared traditions, shared limits on acceptable strategy. We had studied those assumptions carefully during our years as their newest member species, and we had built our entire approach around exploiting exactly the confidence those assumptions produced. A representative of one of the Council's oldest client species, a squadron commander whose vessel we later captured largely intact, told our interrogation officers something that stayed with me long after the battle ended. He said that his people had fought wars for over 4 centuries under Council authority, wars with clear rules, expected casualties, and negotiated conclusions that allowed both sides to preserve their dignity and their future relationships. He said he had never encountered an enemy that seemed to have no interest in preserving anything about the encounter beyond its swift, total conclusion. He said his people had a saying reserved for the most feared natural disasters their homeworld experienced, sudden fires that swept entire regions clean without warning, leaving nothing behind to rebuild from except ash. He said his crew had begun calling us by that name during the battle itself, whispered between stations as our ships tore through formations that should have held for hours, according to every tactical model they had trained on. Ashmakers. That word spread quickly among the surviving crews we captured, translated across a dozen different languages within days, becoming the name by which humanity would be known throughout Council territory for the remainder of the conflict. I did not feel pride hearing it, nor did I feel shame. I felt only a grim recognition that the name fit precisely what we had chosen to become in answer to what had been done to Ambassador Osei. By the 6th hour of the Threshold Gate engagement, the Council formation had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Surviving ships either surrendered individually or attempted disorganized retreats toward the interior of Council territory, pursued only far enough to ensure they posed no further immediate threat to our advancing supply lines. I ordered my own formation to hold position rather than pursue further, mindful of Admiral Ashby's instructions to preserve resources for the larger campaign still ahead. I walked through the wreckage recovery operations personally in the days following the battle, observing our salvage teams working alongside medical personnel treating survivors from both sides. I remember speaking briefly with a young engineer named Rowan Ackerman, who had helped design several of the tactical systems used during the engagement, systems adapted from studies of ancient human conflicts fought centuries before space travel had even become possible. Rowan told me something that clarified, for the first time, exactly why our approach had proven so devastatingly effective against forces built around centuries of ritualized warfare. He said that every tactic we employed had been drawn from moments in human history when total, decisive victory had been the only acceptable outcome, moments when half measures or negotiated compromises would have simply prolonged suffering rather than ending it. He described several examples pulled from those old archives, moments when human commanders faced choices between prolonged, indecisive engagement and rapid, overwhelming action, and how every historical analysis concluded that decisive action, however difficult to authorize, ultimately produced fewer total casualties than conflicts allowed to stretch across months or years of careful maneuvering. I asked him whether he believed the same lesson applied here, against species we barely understood, fighting for reasons far removed from any conflict our ancestors had once fought. He said the lesson was not really about the enemy at all. It was about recognizing that mercy sometimes looks like speed, and cruelty sometimes hides inside patience. He said that the galaxy's other species had built their entire military traditions around the assumption that conflict was a permanent feature of civilization, something to be managed and ritualized rather than eliminated entirely. Humanity, by contrast, had spent its own bloody history learning that the only way to truly end a conflict was to make continued resistance so costly that no rational commander would choose to prolong it. I thought about Ambassador Osei often during those weeks following the Threshold Gate victory, wondering whether she could have imagined, standing in that burning chamber, that her final words would become the foundation for a military campaign capable of shattering Council authority across entire sectors within a matter of months. I suspected, somehow, that she would have understood exactly what those words meant to accomplish, even if she never imagined the specific shape our response would take. News of the Threshold Gate battle spread quickly among Council client species, many of whom had grown resentful of centuries spent fighting wars on the Council's behalf without ever receiving equal representation or protection in return. Several smaller species began quietly reaching out through intermediaries, seeking terms that would allow them to withdraw from Council military obligations entirely, unwilling to continue risking their own forces in a conflict they increasingly viewed as unwinnable. Admiral Ashby authorized limited negotiations with these client species, recognizing that fracturing Council authority from within would prove far more effective than attempting to conquer every allied world through direct military action alone. Within weeks, 3 separate client species had formally withdrawn their fleets from Council command, citing losses at the Threshold Gate as proof that continued participation offered no realistic path toward victory. I received word during this period that Council Central Command had finally recalled Waypoint 6's surviving staff for formal questioning, seeking to understand exactly how such a devastating defeat had been allowed to unfold without any prior warning reaching Central authorities. Reports suggested growing panic among Council leadership, unable to explain to their own populations how a species they had considered primitive and unworthy of full diplomatic respect had managed to shatter their most trusted defensive positions within a matter of weeks. I did not feel satisfaction hearing these reports, though I understood why many among our fleet did. I felt instead a quiet certainty that we had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to the relationship humanity once shared with the wider galaxy. Whatever came next, whether continued resistance or eventual surrender, the Council would never again be able to treat human lives as expendable lessons meant to demonstrate their authority over lesser species. As our fleet prepared for the next phase of the campaign, moving steadily deeper into Council territory, toward their most heavily defended positions, I found myself reflecting on how quickly the galaxy's perception of humanity had transformed. We had entered Council space as eager newcomers, hopeful for acceptance among older, more established civilizations. We were leaving that same space as something the galaxy had never encountered before, a species capable of total, decisive action when pushed beyond the limits of its patience. The name Ashmakers continued to spread throughout Council territory in the weeks that followed, whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect among species who had never imagined humanity capable of such thorough, uncompromising warfare. I understood, standing on the deck of my cruiser as we prepared for our advance toward Council Prime itself, that we were no longer fighting simply to answer the death of a single ambassador. We were fighting to ensure that no species in this galaxy would ever again believe that human lives, human dignity, or human patience could be tested without consequence. Ambassador Osei's final words had become something far larger than a personal request for remembrance. They had become the foundation of an entirely new relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy, one written not through diplomatic negotiation, but through the undeniable, total consequences of our response. Council Prime appeared on my tactical display 3 months after the Threshold Gate battle, a bright cluster of light surrounded by defensive rings so dense they resembled a solid wall from a distance. I had studied this approach for weeks, memorizing every defensive position, every fortified station, every possible avenue of attack, yet seeing it directly still filled me with a weight I had not expected. Admiral Ashby gathered the full command staff for a final briefing before the assault began, and I remember the quiet in that room. Dozens of officers who had spent months fighting across a dozen different fronts, now facing the final objective of the entire campaign. He told us that Council Prime represented more than a military target. It represented the heart of an authority that had believed itself untouchable, a belief that had cost Ambassador Osei her life, and had nearly cost humanity its future as an independent species among the stars. He explained that our intelligence networks, expanded significantly through cooperation with client species who had abandoned Council command after the Threshold Gate defeat, had identified serious divisions within the Council leadership itself. Several delegates, recognizing the scale of the disaster they had caused, were reportedly seeking ways to negotiate a surrender before their homeworld suffered direct assault. Others, more stubborn or more desperate, continued gathering whatever forces remained loyal to them for one final defense. I led the Vanguard Assault Force personally, a decision Admiral Ashby made after reviewing my performance throughout the campaign, though I suspected he also wanted someone present who had witnessed Ambassador Osei's death firsthand through Mira Kessler's testimony, someone who understood exactly what this final battle was meant to conclude. Our approach began with a series of coordinated strikes against Council Prime's outer defensive rings, disabling automated weapon platforms and clearing safe corridors for our main assault force to advance without unnecessary casualties on either side. I had grown increasingly focused, throughout the later stages of the campaign, on minimizing harm where possible once resistance had been sufficiently broken, understanding that total victory did not require unlimited destruction, only the complete removal of any capacity for continued defiance. Political fallout among Council client species accelerated rapidly as our forces approached the homeworld itself. Several delegations that had remained loyal throughout the earlier campaign now sent formal messages seeking separate peace terms, unwilling to share in whatever consequences awaited the Council leadership directly responsible for Ambassador Osei's death. Admiral Ashby authorized these negotiations personally, recognizing that isolating the original decision-makers from their broader alliance would prove far more valuable than treating every species equally, regardless of their actual role in the atrocity that started this war. I remember reviewing intercepted communications from within Council Prime itself during those final days before our main assault began, messages revealing genuine panic among delegates who had once seemed so confident in their authority over lesser species. Several delegates argued publicly for immediate surrender, citing the complete collapse of their military position and the growing likelihood that continued resistance would only increase the severity of whatever consequences humanity intended to impose. Others, including several delegates who had personally overseen Ambassador Osei's execution, continued insisting that surrender would represent an unacceptable admission of weakness, one that would embolden other species throughout the galaxy to challenge Council authority in the future. I found their reasoning almost incomprehensible, given the scale of destruction their previous confidence had already brought upon their own civilization, yet I understood that pride, once deeply embedded in a species' governing philosophy, rarely disappears easily, even when survival itself hangs in the balance. Our main assault against Council Prime began at dawn, according to the planet's own rotational cycle, a detail our intelligence teams had specifically requested to maximize visibility for the civilian population below, understanding that this moment would be remembered for generations regardless of its outcome. I watched from my command vessel as our forces descended through the remaining defensive positions, meeting resistance that grew increasingly desperate and disorganized the closer we advanced toward the central government complex. I made the decision, alongside several other senior officers, to lead a ground assault team directly toward the Chamber of Judgment, the very location where Ambassador Osei had been executed months earlier. I felt it mattered, beyond any purely military consideration, that human forces personally reclaim that specific location, transforming it from a symbol of council authority into something entirely different. I remember a young soldier under my command, a sergeant named Talia Bergstrom, who had lost a cousin working as a trade liaison on a council client world years before this conflict began, one of many quiet losses our species had absorbed without protest during the years we sought acceptance among older civilizations. She moved through those final corridors with a discipline that impressed me even amid the chaos of close engagement, never allowing personal grief to compromise the caution our approach demanded. When we finally cleared the last defensive position before the chamber itself, she asked only whether she could be among those present when the doors opened. I told her yes, understanding that many among us carried reasons of their own for wanting to witness this moment directly. The defenders guarding the Chamber of Judgment fought with more determination than almost any force we had encountered throughout the campaign, understanding perhaps better than anyone else exactly what our presence there would mean for the future of council authority. Our advance through the complex took hours longer than similar operations elsewhere on the planet, corridor by corridor, chamber by chamber, until we finally reached the massive doors leading into the room itself. I remember standing before those doors, remembering every detail from Mira Kessler's testimony, the pale light, the rising heat, Ambassador Osei's final steady words spoken directly into a broadcast meant to intimidate an entire galaxy. I ordered the doors opened, and I stepped inside a room that had haunted human memory since the moment its broadcast first reached our worlds. The chamber itself looked smaller than I had imagined, its high seats now empty, its ceremonial lighting dimmed and lifeless. I stood exactly where Ambassador Osei had stood during her final moments, feeling the weight of every life lost throughout this campaign settle over me at once. Every human casualty, every alien casualty, every consequence born from a single decision made by delegates who believed cruelty could be exercised without cost. I ordered our communications team to establish a direct broadcast connection to every remaining council network still functioning across the galaxy, understanding that this moment required witnesses far beyond the walls of this single chamber. When the connection confirmed, I did not deliver a speech of my own. Instead, I ordered the original recording of Ambassador Osei's final words replayed, unedited, exactly as she had spoken them months earlier, broadcast now from the very location where she had died, this time carried by human forces who had answered her final request completely. Do not grieve for me, remember me instead, and let them learn what that means. I do not know exactly how many species received that broadcast, but reports afterward suggested it reached nearly every corner of Council territory simultaneously, along with every neutral world that had watched this conflict unfold from a careful distance. I understood, standing in that chamber, that we had finally answered the message the Council once tried to send through Ambassador Osei's death, replacing it with a message entirely our own. Council Central Leadership formally requested surrender terms less than 6 hours after that broadcast concluded, their remaining defensive forces standing down across the entire homeworld almost simultaneously. I received word of their surrender request while still standing in the Chamber of Judgment, surrounded by soldiers who had fought alongside me since the earliest days of this campaign, many of whom had lost friends and family members throughout the preceding months. I felt no immediate sense of celebration hearing that news, only a quiet exhaustion mixed with something closer to relief that the most destructive phase of this conflict had finally concluded. I understood that difficult questions remained ahead, questions about justice, about accountability, about how humanity intended to shape its future relationship with a galaxy that had witnessed exactly what we were capable of when pushed beyond the limits of our patience. Admiral Ashby arrived at Council Prime personally within days of the surrender, overseeing initial negotiations alongside representatives from several client species who had abandoned Council authority earlier in the campaign. I attended several of these early sessions, watching as delegates who had once spoken with such confident authority now struggled to articulate terms that might satisfy a species they had fundamentally misunderstood from the moment of first contact. I learned, during these negotiations, that several of the delegates directly responsible for ordering Ambassador Osei's execution had already been identified and separated from the broader council leadership, held pending whatever formal accountability process humanity and its allies eventually established. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions hearing this news, understanding that punishment, however deserved, would never fully repair what had been lost throughout this entire tragedy. I thought often, during those early days of negotiation, about Mira Kessler, the young aide whose testimony had helped confirm every detail of what happened inside that chamber months earlier. I learned that she had remained with Fleet Command throughout the entire campaign, working alongside intelligence teams to ensure that Ambassador Osei's story remained accurately documented for whatever historical record eventually emerged from this conflict. I requested a meeting with her personally, once initial negotiations at Council Prime had stabilized enough to allow senior officers brief periods away from direct oversight. When we finally spoke, I found her calmer than I expected, though something in her expression suggested she carried the same weight I felt, a recognition that we had both witnessed history bend in directions neither of us could have fully anticipated when this crisis first began. She told me that she had watched the broadcast from the Chamber of Judgment personally, recognizing immediately what it meant for those final words to finally reach the entire galaxy, exactly as Ambassador Osei had intended. She said she finally felt, for the first time since witnessing that execution, that Renata's death had been answered completely, not through simple vengeance, but through a demonstration so total that no species would ever again mistake human patience for weakness. I agreed with her assessment, though I understood that the true consequences of this campaign would take years to fully unfold. Council authority across the galaxy had been shattered beyond any realistic hope of restoration to its previous form. Client species that had once fought loyally under Council command now negotiated independently for their own futures, freed from an authority that had proven itself both cruel and catastrophically unprepared for the consequences of that cruelty. I stood at the window of my temporary quarters aboard Council Prime that evening, watching the planet's twin moons rise over a horizon still marked by the visible scars of our recent assault, and I felt the full weight of everything that had led to this moment. Ambassador Osei's death had been intended as a lesson in humility for an entire species. Instead, it had become the foundation for humanity's complete transformation, from a hopeful newcomer into a power that the rest of the galaxy would never again underestimate. The war itself had effectively concluded, but I understood, standing there in the quiet aftermath, that the most difficult questions still remained ahead of us. What justice would look like for those responsible? What place humanity would occupy in a galaxy that now viewed us with genuine fear rather than simple curiosity? What Ambassador Osei's final legacy would ultimately become, beyond the immediate military victory her death had inadvertently set into motion? The formal surrender ceremony took place nearly 2 months after our forces first secured Council Prime, held not in the grand halls the Council once used for their ceremonial gatherings, but in a simple open courtyard, chosen specifically because it belonged to no single species and carried no history of ritual or authority. I stood among the human delegation that day, watching representatives from dozens of species sign documents that would reshape the balance of power across the entire galaxy. I want to describe what justice actually looked like, because I know many people back on Earth expected something far more absolute than what eventually took place. The delegates directly responsible for ordering Ambassador Osei's execution faced a formal tribunal established jointly by humanity and several client species who had suffered under Council authority for generations. I attended portions of these proceedings personally, curious to understand how a species so recently transformed by total war would handle questions of accountability once the fighting itself had ended. The tribunal ultimately sentenced 3 senior delegates to permanent removal from any position of galactic authority, along with lengthy confinement on a facility maintained jointly by several formerly client species, eager to ensure such decisions could never again be made without consequence. I remember feeling surprised that the sentences did not include execution of any kind, and I asked Admiral Ashby directly why humanity had chosen restraint after everything that had unfolded throughout this conflict. He told me something I have carried with me ever since, a reflection that seemed to summarize everything our species had learned throughout this entire tragedy. He said that responding to cruelty with total war had been necessary to prevent further cruelty from being repeated against us, or against any other species the Council might have targeted in the future. But he said that responding to individual accountability with the same cruelty the Council had shown Ambassador Osei would have proven that we had learned nothing from her death at all. I understood, hearing his explanation, that humanity's response throughout this entire conflict had never truly been about vengeance in its simplest form. It had been about establishing, permanently and unmistakably, that no species could treat human lives as expendable lessons without facing consequences severe enough to prevent any repetition. Once that lesson had been thoroughly established through our military campaign, further cruelty toward individuals, however deserving of punishment, would have undermined the very principle we had fought to protect. I traveled briefly to a neutral station months after the surrender, a waypoint that had never fallen under Council authority and had watched the entire conflict unfold from a careful, uninvolved distance. I met there with a merchant named Osric Vantry, whose trading routes passed through both former Council territory and independent systems that had never taken a side throughout the war. He told me that neutral observers had spent the entire conflict debating what humanity's methods meant for the future balance of galactic power, some fearing that our willingness toward total, decisive action made us dangerous allies at best, others arguing that our clear limits, demonstrated through the restraint we eventually showed toward individual accountability, made us more trustworthy than species who claimed peaceful traditions yet quietly permitted cruelty when it proved convenient. I found his perspective useful, a reminder that the galaxy's judgment of humanity would not settle quickly into any single, simple narrative. Some would remember only the speed and totality of our military campaign, frightened by capabilities they had never previously needed to consider when calculating the risks of provoking a newer, smaller species. Others would remember the restraint we showed once total victory had been achieved, recognizing that our response, however overwhelming, had never sought conquest or unnecessary destruction beyond what was required to prevent further atrocity. I spent considerable time in the months following the surrender, speaking with representatives from various client species who had once served under Council authority, curious to understand how the broader galaxy now viewed humanity following everything that had transpired. Many expressed a complicated mixture of respect and genuine unease, recognizing that our species possessed capabilities and a willingness to use them that none of them had previously encountered among any civilization they had known. One representative, an older diplomat named Serenia Halkoth, from a species that had suffered under Council authority for nearly 6 centuries, told me something during one of our conversations that stayed with me long afterward. She said her people had always assumed that any species new to galactic society would eventually be shaped by older, more established civilizations, gradually learning to accept whatever place those civilizations assigned to them. She said humanity had proven, through both tragedy and total response, that some species arrive already knowing exactly what they will and will not accept, regardless of how established the powers around them might be. I found myself reflecting often on how dramatically humanity's position within the galaxy had shifted throughout this single, brutal year. We had entered galactic society as eager newcomers, hopeful for acceptance among species far older and more numerous than ourselves, willing to accept diminished status in exchange for peaceful integration into a community we barely understood. We emerged from this conflict as something the galaxy had never previously encountered, a species whose patience, once exhausted, produced consequences unlike anything their history had prepared them to expect. I reunited briefly with Freya Lindquist and Isolde Marchetti during a gathering held for surviving crew members of our original task force, a quiet event held aboard a repurposed cruiser rather than any formal ceremony, since most of us had grown uncomfortable with grand displays after everything we had witnessed together. Freya told me she had requested reassignment to a new division focused on rebuilding communication channels between humanity and the many independent species now negotiating their own place within a galaxy no longer organized under a single dominant authority. She said she wanted to help build something lasting from the wreckage of what our campaign had necessarily destroyed. Isolde told me something different, quieter, more personal. She said that avenging her brother had never brought the peace she once imagined it would, though she did not regret the choice she made to join this fight. She said she had finally stopped waiting for someone else to answer the losses her family carried, and that feeling, however incomplete, mattered more to her than any single moment of victory ever could. I did not know how to answer her fully, so I simply sat with her in silence for a while, understanding that some wounds this war had opened would take far longer to heal than the conflict itself had taken to conclude. I thought about how differently each of us carried this experience, Freya searching for something to build, Isolde searching for something resembling peace, Mira searching for a way to ensure Ambassador Osei's memory outlived the immediate shock of her death, myself searching, perhaps, for some way to reconcile the soldier I had become with the person I had been before any of this began. I did not find easy answers to those questions in the months that followed, though I found, gradually, a kind of steadiness that came from knowing we had answered cruelty honestly, without losing ourselves entirely to it in return. Mira Kessler remained closely involved throughout the post-war period, eventually taking on a formal role helping establish new diplomatic protocols meant to prevent any future crisis from unfolding the way Ambassador Osei's execution had. I met with her periodically during this time, watching her transform from the frightened young aide I remembered from her earliest testimony into someone determined to ensure that no future ambassador would ever face a similar fate without immediate and unified response from their own people. She told me during one of our final conversations before I eventually returned to less demanding duties that she had begun working on a memorial dedicated to Ambassador Osei, to be constructed on Council Prime itself rather than back on Earth, ensuring that every species passing through this system would understand exactly what price had been paid for the cruelty that once defined Council authority. I attended the memorial's dedication ceremony nearly a year after the war's conclusion, standing among representatives from dozens of species who had gathered to witness its unveiling. The memorial itself was simple by design, a single figure standing calm and unafraid, modeled directly after images captured during Ambassador Osei's final moments. Her expression steady rather than fearful, her posture dignified rather than broken by whatever cruelty had been intended toward her. Beneath the figure, inscribed in dozens of languages representing every species that had participated in either the conflict or its eventual resolution, appeared her final words exactly as she had spoken them. "Do not grieve. Remember." I stood reading those words alongside delegates from species that had once fought against us, species that had abandoned Council authority during the campaign, and species that had remained carefully neutral throughout the entire conflict, watching from a cautious distance. I thought, standing there, about everything this single sentence had come to represent throughout the preceding year. It had begun as the final request of a woman facing an unimaginable death, a plea to her own people not to be consumed by simple grief. It had become, through humanity's response, something far larger, a foundation for an entirely new relationship between our species and the rest of the galaxy, one built not on hopeful acceptance, but on mutual, unmistakable respect born from consequence. I do not know how future historians will ultimately judge everything that unfolded during this brief, violent chapter of human history among the stars. I understand that our response frightened many species who had never imagined humanity capable of such total, decisive action. I understand also that this same response ensured, perhaps permanently, that no species throughout this galaxy would ever again consider human lives, human dignity, or human patience something that could be tested without severe and lasting consequence. Humanity did not go to war seeking conquest, nor did we seek glory through our victory over Council forces. We went to war because a woman we respected had been murdered publicly, deliberately, and without any genuine justification beyond a desire to demonstrate authority over a species the Council had wrongly believed too young and too weak to answer such cruelty in kind. We answered completely, and in doing so, we ensured that her death, however tragic, would never be forgotten, nor repeated against anyone else who dared to represent humanity among the stars. I left Council Prime for the final time several weeks after the memorial's dedication, returning to Earth for what I hoped would be a quieter chapter of my own service, though I understood that the galaxy humanity now occupied looked nothing like the one we had entered so hopefully years earlier. We had become something new among the stars, respected, feared, and above all, understood clearly by every species who now knew exactly what awaited anyone who mistook our patience for weakness. Ambassador Renata Osei asked us not to grieve, but to remember, and I believe, looking back across everything that followed her death, that humanity honored that request completely. We remembered her courage in that final moment. We remembered every word she spoke as fire closed around her. We remembered, above all, the simple truth she wanted the galaxy to understand, that cruelty inflicted upon even a single human life would never again be treated as a lesson the rest of us could simply accept in silence. The galaxy remembers her too now, whether through fear, respect, or grudging acknowledgement of what her death ultimately set into motion. Her memorial stands today on Council Prime, a quiet reminder to every species that passes through that system of exactly what price cruelty demands when directed against those who refuse to forget. I visit that memorial whenever my duties bring me back to that system, standing before her calm, steady figure, remembering exactly as she asked us to, and understanding that some promises, once made, echo far beyond the single life that first inspired them.